The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune above Dr. Cordelia Blackthorne's head as she bent over the lightbox, her magnifying glass poised over a collection of daguerreotypes that had arrived that morning from the Ashworth estate. Basement archives of Harvard's Peabody Museum felt particularly oppressive tonight, the weight of centuries of preserved history pressing down through layers of concrete and steel. Outside, October rain drummed against the narrow windows near the ceiling, each droplet catching the pale light and casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with climate-controlled storage units. "Another box of Victorian death portraits and garden parties," muttered Ezekiel Thorne from across the examination table, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a graduate student who had spent too many late nights cataloging the remnants of lives long forgotten. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and rubbed his eyes, leaving red marks on the bridge where the frames had been resting for the past 6 hours. "Sometimes I wonder if these old families did anything besides pose for photographs and die dramatically." Cordelia didn't respond immediately, her attention captured by something that made her breath catch in her throat. Among the usual collection of stiff family portraits and formal group arrangements, one image stood apart with an unsettling quality that seemed to draw her gaze like a magnet. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, the silver coating, still lustrous despite its age, suggesting it had been stored with unusual care. According to the estate documentation, it had been taken in Salem, Massachusetts in 1899 by a traveling photographer whose name was listed simply as C. Vex. The subject was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing in what appeared to be an elegantly appointed Victorian parlor. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow against the darker tones of the room, its fabric catching the photographer's, lighting in a way that made her appear almost ethereal. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from her face, emphasizing the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the hollow shadows beneath her eyes. But it was those eyes that held Cordelia transfixed, large dark pools that seemed to stare not merely at the camera, but through it, as if the child could see directly into the souls of anyone who dared to look upon her image. In her small hands, she held an ornate birdcage, its brass bars gleaming with meticulous care. The cage was beautiful, clearly expensive, with intricate scrollwork and delicate filigree that spoke of craftsmanship from a more elegant age. Yet it was conspicuously, deliberately empty. No perch held a colorful songbird, no tiny dishes contained seed or water. The emptiness of the cage seemed to radiate from the photograph like a void, creating an absence that felt more present than presence itself. "Ezekiel," Cordelia called softly, never taking her eyes from the image. "Come look at this." Her research assistant set down his cataloging notes and moved around the table to peer over her shoulder. The moment his gaze fell upon the photograph, she heard his sharp intake of breath. The girl's expression was indeed unnaturally solemn for a child, but there was something else, something that made the modern eye want to look away even as it felt compelled to study every detail. "That's unsettling," Ezekiel murmured, unconsciously stepping back from the lightbox. "There's something wrong with her eyes. They're too knowing, too adult. Children didn't look like that in Victorian photographs, did they? Even with all the formal posing conventions?" "No," Cordelia agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even accounting for the long exposure times and the necessity of remaining perfectly still, there's an awareness in her gaze that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Look at the way she's holding that cage. Not like a beloved pet's home, but like evidence." The parlor setting was typical of the era, with heavy draperies framing tall windows, ornate furniture arranged with mathematical precision, and wallpaper that created intricate patterns in the background. Yet something about the room felt wrong, as if the very air within the photograph was somehow thicker, more oppressive than it should be. The shadows fell at odd angles, creating dark corners that seemed to swallow light rather than merely reflecting. "Let's scan this one tonight," Cordelia decided, carefully lifting the daguerreotype with cotton gloves. "I want to examine it under digital enhancement. There's something about this image that demands closer inspection." They moved to the digital workstation in the corner of the archive room, where Ezekiel had set up the high-resolution scanner capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. As he prepared the equipment, adjusting the lighting and calibrating the color sensors, Cordelia found herself unable to stop staring at the photograph. The girl's face seemed to follow her movements, those dark eyes tracking her progress across the room with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The estate documentation lists her as Seraphina Whitmore. Ezekiel read from his notes as the scanner hummed to life. Daughter of Bartholomew Whitmore, a merchant family from Salem. The house was on Chestnut Street, apparently quite grand in its day. The family seems to have fallen on hard times by the 1890s, according to these records. Seraphina, Cordelia, repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. An angelic name for a child who looks as though she's seen the depths of hell. The scanning process took nearly 20 minutes, the high-resolution sensors capturing every minute detail of the daguerreotype's surface. As the image slowly built up on the computer screen, pixel by pixel, both researchers found themselves leaning forward in fascination. The digital version revealed textures and subtle gradations of tone that were impossible to detect with the naked eye, turning the already haunting photograph into something approaching the supernatural in its clarity and depth. My God, Ezekiel breathed as he began to adjust the contrast and brightness levels. Look at the detail in her dress, the way the light catches every fold of fabric. And that cage, you can see individual scratches in the brass, wear marks from years of use. But as he continued to manipulate the image, enhancing different aspects and adjusting the digital settings, something else began to emerge from the background shadows. What had initially appeared to be merely the complex patterns of Victorian wallpaper started to resolve into shapes that were far more disturbing. Wait, Cordelia said, her hand gripping Ezekiel's wrist to stop his movements. Go back to that last adjustment. There, in the shadows behind her. Do you see it? Ezekiel reversed the enhancement and began to slowly increase the shadow detail again. As he did, both researchers watched in growing horror as shapes began to materialize in the darkness behind young Seraphina. What they had initially dismissed as furniture or wallpaper patterns were revealing themselves to be something else entirely. Forms that suggested human figures standing in the background of the photograph. Figures that shouldn't be there according to any conventional understanding of 19th century photography. The first figure to emerge clearly was that of an elderly woman, her Victorian dress hanging in tattered folds around a frame that seemed almost translucent. She stood directly behind the child, her hands positioned as if resting on Seraphina's shoulders, though no physical contact was visible in the original exposure. Her face, when it finally resolved into clarity, was a study in aristocratic decay, with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected no light whatsoever. This is impossible, Ezekiel whispered, his fingers trembling as he continued to adjust the image parameters. Multiple exposures weren't common in 1899, and even if they were, the positioning is all wrong. These figures are integrated into the scene as if they were actually there during the photograph session. As he enhanced different sections of the background, more figures began to appear. A man in a top hat stood near the window, his form partially obscured by the heavy draperies but clearly present nonetheless. A child roughly the same age as Seraphina sat in what had appeared to be an empty chair, her small hands folded in her lap, and her expression matching the same unnaturally solemn demeanor as the photograph's primary subject. But it was the final discovery that made both researchers step back from the computer screen in shock. As Ezekiel applied the maximum enhancement to the supposedly empty birdcage, something small and bird-like became visible within the brass confines. Not a living creature, but something that had once been alive, its tiny form preserved in the daguerreotype like a specimen in amber. Cordelia, Ezekiel's voice was barely audible. What exactly did we just uncover? The enhanced photograph stared back at them from the computer screen, its secrets now partially revealed but raising far more questions than answers. Seraphina Whitmore stood in her white dress, surrounded by figures that existed somewhere between life and death, holding a birdcage that was simultaneously empty and occupied. And in her dark eyes, that same knowing intelligence seemed to be watching them across the span of 112 years, as if she had been waiting all this time for someone to finally see the truth hidden in the shadows of her world. Outside, the October rain continued to fall, and in the basement archives of Harvard's Peabody Museum, two researchers found themselves face to face with a mystery that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of photographic truth and the secrets that the past refuses to surrender. Salem, Massachusetts, October 1899. The grandfather clock in the front hall chimed 11 times, its deep bronze voice echoing through the corridors of the Whitmore mansion with a resonance that seemed to linger longer than natural acoustics should allow. 8-year-old Seraphina Whitmore counted each chime from her position at the top of the main staircase, her small fingers gripping the polished mahogany banister as she peered down through the spindles at the foyer below. The gaslight fixtures cast dancing shadows across the Persian runner that led from the front door to her father's study, creating patterns that moved independently of their sources and sometimes took shapes that made her press herself closer to the wall. The house had rules, spoken and unspoken, that governed every aspect of Seraphina's existence. She must never enter father's study without invitation, never venture into the servants' quarters after dark, and most importantly, never speak of her playmates to the occasional visitors who still called upon the Whitmore residence. These rules had been impressed upon her since she could first understand language, delivered in her father's increasingly hollow voice with an urgency that had grown more pronounced as their circumstances became more dire. Bartholomew Whitmore had once been Salem's most successful shipping merchant, his vessels carrying exotic goods from distant ports to the hungry markets of New England. The Whitmore name had commanded respect in drawing rooms and counting houses alike, their Chestnut Street mansion a testament to prosperity built upon the treacherous foundation of maritime commerce. But the sea was a fickle mistress, and a series of storms, piracy, and ill-timed investments had reduced the family's fortune to little more than the creaking bones of their ancestral home, and the increasingly desperate measures Bartholomew employed to maintain their social standing. Seraphina understood, in the peculiar way that children sometimes grasp truths that adults struggle to acknowledge, that their house was no longer merely a home. It had become something else entirely, a repository for things that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was remembered. The third floor, which had once housed the servants' quarters, was now forbidden territory, though she could sometimes hear movement above her bedroom ceiling in the dark hours before dawn. Her father insisted these sounds were merely the settling of old wood, but Seraphina knew better. The house was full of residents who cast no shadows and left no footprints, guests who had arrived over the years and simply never departed. On this particular October morning, the familiar rhythm of the house was disrupted by the arrival of a visitor who carried with him the scent of chemicals and the promise of permanence. Cornelius Vex was a traveling photographer, a gaunt man with silver hair and fingers stained permanent black from years of working with photographic solutions. His equipment cases and tripods filled the foyer like the tools of some arcane profession, which Seraphina supposed they were. Photography was still enough of a novelty in their social circle that his presence generated both excitement and unease among the household's various inhabitants, visible and otherwise. Mr. Vex has come to photograph our remaining valuables for insurance purposes, her father explained as they gathered in the morning parlor, his voice carrying the careful modulation of a man who had learned to speak around difficult truths. Bartholomew Whitmore had aged considerably in the past year, his once robust frame now gaunt beneath his carefully maintained clothing. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, was combed with mathematical precision, but could not disguise the hollowness that had crept into his eyes. It's a prudent measure given the uncertainties of our current situation. Seraphina nodded dutifully, though she suspected the insurance documentation was merely a convenient excuse. The truth, which seemed to hover around her father like a visible aura of desperation, was that he was preparing to sell what remained of their possessions. The shipping business had failed completely, the creditors were becoming more aggressive in their demands, and the house itself was beginning to require a different kind of payment to maintain their tenuous existence within its walls. Mr. Vex moved through their home with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to capturing the essence of things before they disappeared forever. His camera, A massive contraption of brass and mahogany, mounted on sturdy legs, seemed to observe the rooms with an intelligence of its own. As he arranged his equipment and prepared his photographic plates, Seraphina watched from the doorway, fascinated by the ritual of image creation. The child should be included in some of the portraits, Vex suggested, his voice carrying the authority of professional experience. Family photographs often prove more valuable than simple documentation of objects. They tell a story that transcends mere monetary worth. Her father's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Seraphina caught it nonetheless. Perhaps, Bartholomew replied carefully, though we should be selective about which items we include. Some of our possessions have sentimental value that extends beyond their material worth. The photographer's eyes swept the parlor, taking in the heavy furniture, the elaborate wallpaper, and the various objets d'art that still adorned the mantelpiece and side tables. When his gaze fell upon the ornate birdcage that sat in its place of honor near the tall windows, his expression shifted subtly. The cage was indeed beautiful, its brass bars worked into intricate patterns that caught and reflected the morning, light in complex geometries. It was also conspicuously empty, though the accessories of avian habitation, tiny dishes for food and water, a small mirror, a delicate swing, remained in perfect position as if awaiting the return of a beloved occupant. The birdcage, Vex murmured, approaching it with the reverent attention of a connoisseur recognizing quality craftsmanship. Exceptional work. French, I would estimate, probably mid-century. The kind of piece that suggests both refinement and genuine affection for its intended inhabitant. It housed my daughter's canary, Bartholomew explained, his voice growing softer. A beautiful little creature named Lucinda. Seraphina was quite devoted to her. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that Lucinda had been the first payment, the initial offering that had secured their family's precarious bargain with the forces that now inhabited their home. The bird had been healthy one evening, singing its cheerful songs as Seraphina prepared for bed, and cold and still the next morning, though no sign of illness or injury could be found. That had been 3 months ago, when the house had first begun to feel different, when shadows had started moving independently and whispers could be heard in empty rooms. Seraphina remembered that morning with perfect clarity. Though she had never spoken of it to her father, she had awakened to silence where Lucinda's morning song should have been, and when she had approached the cage, she had found something far more disturbing than a simple dead bird. Lucinda was still there, still singing, still fluttering from perch to perch with the same enthusiastic energy she had always displayed. But she was no longer quite solid, no longer quite present in the way that living things should be. The bird existed now in the same liminal space as the other residents of the Whitmore house, visible to Seraphina's eyes, but apparently invisible to adult perception. I should like to photograph the child with the cage, Vex decided, his artistic instincts clearly engaged by the visual possibilities. The contrast between the ornate beauty of the craftsmanship and the poignancy of its emptiness could create a most compelling image. There's something about empty spaces that speaks to the viewer's imagination, don't you think? As he spoke, Seraphina became aware that they were no longer alone in the parlor. The familiar presence of Mrs. Ashford, the elderly woman who had been the first to join their household's collection of permanent guests, materialized near the mantelpiece. Her Victorian dress, though faded to translucency, still maintained the rigid posture that had characterized her in life. Behind her, gradually becoming more visible, stood the other members of their expanded family. Young Timothy Marsh, who had been roughly Seraphina's age when he had arrived, and Mr. Dalton, the gentleman in the top hat who preferred to position himself near the windows where he could maintain his eternal vigil over the street below. They were all watching the photographer with keen interest, their dark eyes reflecting the same hungry attention that Seraphina had learned to recognize. As anticipation, new visitors to the house were rare, and the residents seemed to understand that Mr. Vex represented something more significant than a simple business transaction. His presence suggested possibilities, opportunities, perhaps even expansion of their peculiar community. "Father," Seraphina said quietly, her small voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Are you certain you wish to proceed with the photographs?" Bartholomew Whitmore looked down at his daughter, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked enough to reveal the depth of his desperation. He was trapped, caught between the mundane pressures of financial ruin and the supernatural obligations that had become the price of their continued existence. The house had provided, after a fashion, delivering unexpected windfalls and convenient coincidences that had kept the creditors at bay. But every blessing came with a cost that was extracted in ways that grew more personal with each passing month. "The photographs are necessary, my dear," he replied, though his eyes couldn't quite meet her gaze. "We must document what we have while we still have it." What he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was that the documentation might serve a different purpose entirely. The house was hungry, had been growing hungrier with each passing week, and the residents were becoming more insistent in their unspoken demands. Seraphina was the last truly living member of the Whitmore family, and her father was beginning to understand that their bargain was approaching its inevitable conclusion. As Cornelius Vex continued his preparations, adjusting his camera and testing his lighting, the atmosphere in the parlor grew thicker, more oppressive. The October sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to dim despite the clear sky outside, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move with purposeful intention. The residents were gathering, drawn by the prospect of witnessing something that would change the fundamental nature of their existence within these walls. Seraphina felt their attention like a physical presence, their silent voices whispering promises and threats that only she could hear. Mrs. Ashford stepped closer, her translucent form becoming more solid with each passing moment, while Timothy Marsh moved to position himself near the chair that would soon hold their living subject. Even Lucinda fluttered with increasing agitation within her beautiful prison, her ethereal wings beating against bars that could no longer contain what she had become. The stage was set, the players were in position, and in the ornate birdcage that would soon become the focal point of a photograph destined to haunt viewers for generations to come, something small and desperate continued its eternal song in frequencies that only the dead and the dying could truly hear. Cambridge, Massachusetts, October 2011. The digital clock on Cordelia's computer screen read 2:47 a.m., its green numerals casting an eerie glow across her face as she hunched over the workstation in the basement archives. The October wind howled outside, rattling the narrow windows and sending skeletal tree branches scraping against the glass with sounds that resembled fingernails dragging across wood. Ezekiel had dozed off in his chair an hour ago, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose as he breathed with the steady rhythm of exhaustion. But Cordelia could not sleep, could not even consider stepping away from the computer screen where Seraphina Whitmore's photograph continued to reveal its secrets, layer by digital layer. What had begun as routine enhancement work had evolved into something approaching an obsession. Each new adjustment to the image parameters unveiling details that challenged her understanding of both photographic science and historical documentation. The basement felt colder now, as if the very act of examining the daguerreotype had somehow altered the temperature of their modern sanctuary. She had been working systematically, dividing the photograph into grid sections and applying different enhancement algorithms to each quadrant. The results had been progressively more disturbing as the night wore on. The elderly woman standing behind Seraphina, whom Cordelia had begun mentally referring to as Mrs. Ashford, based on the woman's imperious bearing, had resolved into startling clarity. Her Victorian dress, though translucent in the original exposure, showed intricate details of beadwork and lace that spoke of considerable expense and social standing. More unsettling was the woman's face, which displayed an expression of predatory satisfaction, as if she were witnessing something she had long anticipated. "The positioning is impossible," Cordelia murmured to herself, adjusting the contrast to bring out more detail in the woman's features. If she were actually present during the photograph session, the exposure time would have captured her as a solid figure. But if she weren't there, how did her image appear on the daguerreotype plate with such perfect integration into the lighting and perspective? She had researched every known technique for creating multiple exposures and photographic tricks available to photographers in 1899, but none could account for what she was seeing. The figures weren't superimposed or added after the fact. They were present in the original image capture, existing simultaneously with Seraphina while maintaining their ethereal, translucent quality. As she continued her digital archaeology, more residents of the Whitmore parlor emerged from the shadows. The man in the top hat, positioned near the window, possessed a gaunt elegance that suggested aristocratic bearing fallen into decay. His clothes, like those of Mrs. Ashford, showed signs of having once been expensive, but now appeared worn and somehow insubstantial, as if the very fabric existed in a state between memory and reality. When she enhanced his facial features, Cordelia discovered eyes that were not merely dark but seemed to absorb light entirely, creating voids in the photographic emulsion that registered as pure black. "My God," she whispered, zooming in on those impossible eyes. "It's as if they're not reflecting any light whatsoever. How is that even photographically possible?" The third figure, the child she had initially mistaken for furniture shadows, proved to be the most disturbing discovery yet. The boy, for closer examination, revealed masculine features beneath the androgynous styling common to children's fashion of the era, sat in a chair with the rigid posture expected of Victorian portrait subjects. But his small hands, folded carefully in his lap, showed signs of having been positioned by someone else, and his expression carried the same unnaturally adult awareness that marked Seraphina's countenance. If you're enjoying this chilling tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. What truly made Cordelia's breath catch, however, was the realization that all three additional figures shared a common characteristic that defied rational explanation. Their clothing, their poses, even their facial expressions suggested they had been present during the actual photography session, participating in the formal ritual of Victorian portraiture. Yet their translucent quality and the way light passed through them indicated they existed in some state between physical presence and complete absence. She created a new file and began systematically documenting her discoveries, taking digital captures of each enhanced section and noting the specific parameters that had revealed the hidden details. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of a pattern in the supernatural residents' positioning. They weren't randomly distributed throughout the parlor, but were arranged in a deliberate configuration around Seraphina, creating a composition that suggested ritual or ceremony rather than coincidental gathering. "Ezekiel," she called softly, not wanting to startle her sleeping assistant but needing to share her mounting excitement and unease. "You need to see this latest enhancement." He stirred slowly, pushing his glasses up his nose and blinking in the blue glow of the computer screen. "What time is it? Have you been working this entire time?" "Look at this," Cordelia said, ignoring his questions and pointing to the screen where she had applied maximum enhancement to the birdcage. "I've been able to isolate the cage from the background and adjust the exposure specifically for that region of the photograph." What appeared on the screen made both researchers lean forward in fascination and horror. Within the supposedly empty birdcage, a small form had become visible. Not solid like the brass bars that contained it, but present nonetheless. The bird, clearly a canary based on its size and proportions, sat on its tiny perch with wings folded and head tilted at an angle that suggested attentive listening. But like the human figures surrounding Seraphina, it existed in that impossible state between presence and absence, its feathers seeming to shimmer with their own internal light while simultaneously allowing the background to show through. "That's impossible," Ezekiel breathed, adjusting his glasses as if the problem might be with his vision rather than what they were seeing. "The cage appears empty in the original photograph. Even with the longest exposure times used in 1899, a living bird would have appeared as solid as everything else in the image." "But what if it wasn't alive?" Cordelia asked quietly, the words feeling strange as she spoke them. "What if nothing in this photograph is entirely alive? At least not in the conventional sense." She had been researching the history of the Whitmore family during her breaks from image enhancement, using the university's extensive digital archives to trace the family's trajectory from prosperity to apparent ruin. The records she had found painted a picture of a once successful merchant family, whose fortunes had declined precipitously in the 1890s, culminating in Bartholomew Whitmore's financial collapse and the eventual abandonment of the Chestnut Street mansion. More intriguing, however, were the patterns she had discovered in Salem's historical records from that period. The Whitmore house appeared to be connected to a series of unexplained disappearances and deaths spanning several decades, incidents that local authorities had attributed to accidents or natural causes, but which showed suspicious similarities when examined collectively. "I've been cross-referencing names from the Salem city records," she explained, opening a new browser window filled with genealogical data. Mrs. Evangeline Ashford disappeared from her home in 1887, supposedly having departed to visit relatives in Boston. No trace of her was ever found, and her estate was eventually settled in absentia. Timothy Marsh, age 8, vanished from his family's home in 1895 while playing in the garden. Again, no body was ever recovered. Ezekiel studied the names and dates, his expression growing more troubled with each connection. And the man in the top hat? Marcus Dalton, a business associate of Bartholomew Whitmore. Last seen leaving a meeting at the Whitmore residence in 1898. His carriage was found the next morning outside the house, but Dalton himself was never located. The official report suggested he might have fallen into the harbor while walking home intoxicated, but witnesses placed him as completely sober during the business meeting. The pattern was becoming clear, though its implications challenged everything they understood about the nature of photographic documentation. The figures appearing in Seraphina's portrait weren't anomalies or technical artifacts. They were specific individuals who had connections to the Whitmore family and who had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the years leading up to the 1899 photograph. But how does a daguerreotype capture images of people who were already missing or dead? Ezekiel asked, voicing the question that had been haunting Cordelia's thoughts throughout the night. She had been considering that very problem as she worked, developing theories that grew progressively more unsettling with each new discovery. Traditional photographic science insisted that images were created by light, reflecting off physical objects and chemically altering the silver compounds on the plate. Yet the figures in Seraphina's portrait seemed to exist independently of normal, optical laws, suggesting the daguerreotype had somehow captured something other than reflected light. "What if," she said slowly, testing the idea as she spoke, "the photograph isn't just documenting what was physically present during the exposure, but what was present in some other sense? What if the camera captured not just the visible spectrum of light, but some other kind of impression or energy that these missing people left behind?" The basement archives felt even colder now, as if their speculations had somehow altered the very atmosphere around them. Outside, the October wind continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the building above them, the heating system cycled on with a mechanical grinding that sounded disturbingly like whispered conversations. As if drawn by some compulsion, they couldn't resist. Both researchers found themselves leaning closer to the computer screen, studying Seraphina's face with renewed intensity. The child's dark eyes seemed even more knowing now, even more aware, as if she were conscious not only of the photographer capturing her image, but of the modern viewers who would eventually discover the truth hidden in the shadows of her world. "There's something else," Cordelia said, her voice barely audible. "I've been enhancing the reflection in the birdcage's mirror, the little one that would have been positioned for the bird's entertainment." She pulled up another file, this one, showing extreme magnification of the tiny mirror within the ornate cage. What appeared in the reflection made both researchers step back from the screen in shock. Instead of showing the reverse angle of the parlor as it should, the mirror reflected something else entirely. A room that appeared to be the same parlor but somehow different, darker, filled with more figures than were visible in the main photograph. Indy, the mirror's reflection. Seraphina stood in the same position, still holding the birdcage, but she was surrounded by dozens of translucent figures, men and women and children of various ages, all dressed in clothing spanning several decades of fashion. They filled the reflected parlor like a congregation gathered for some unholy ceremony. Their collective attention focused on the girl at the center of their arrangement. And in that reflected world, Seraphina's expression was different. While her face in the main photograph showed the solemn resignation of a child who understood her fate, her reflection revealed something far more disturbing, a smile, subtle but unmistakable, as if she were not the victim of whatever was transpiring in the Whitmore parlor, but somehow complicit in it. The enhancement had revealed not just hidden figures in the original photograph, but an entirely different reality existing parallel to the documented scene, visible only in the reversed world of the tiny mirror that had been meant to amuse a pet canary. And in that reversed reality, the true nature of what had occurred in Salem in 1899 was beginning to emerge, suggesting that young Seraphina Whitmore was far more than an innocent child caught in supernatural circumstances. She was, perhaps, the architect of them. Salem, Massachusetts, October 1899. The morning light filtering through the heavy draperies of the Whitmore parlor held an unusual quality, as if the very air had grown thicker overnight, transforming the familiar room into something that existed at the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Seraphina sat in the carved wooden chair that Mr. Vex had positioned precisely 3 feet from his camera, the ornate birdcage balanced carefully in her small lap, its brass bars catching and reflecting the photographer's carefully arranged illumination, in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. She had known this day would come, had felt it approaching with the same inexorable certainty with which one might sense an approaching storm. The house had been whispering to her for months, its walls carrying conversations in languages that predated human speech, its shadows moving with purposeful intelligence that spoke of ancient hungers and patient plans. What her father understood, as desperate bargaining for financial salvation, Seraphina recognized as something far more profound and permanent, the final terms of a contract that had been negotiating itself for longer than anyone currently living could remember. The Whitmore house had not always been a repository for the displaced dead. Once it had been merely an elegant mansion built by her great-grandfather Josiah Whitmore, a shrewd merchant who had understood that true wealth came not just from successful trading, but from the careful cultivation of useful relationships. Josiah had been a practical man, untroubled by superstition or sentiment, and when he had encountered the entity that dwelt in the space between spaces, he had approached the interaction as he would any other business proposition. The entity, Seraphina, had never learned its true name if it possessed one, and had come to think of it simply as the collector, was ancient beyond human comprehension, a presence that fed not on flesh or blood, but on the essential energy that distinguished the living from the dead. It required no worship, demanded no elaborate rituals, asked only for the opportunity to expand its collection of preserved souls in exchange for whatever material benefits its human partners desired most desperately. Josiah Whitmore had desired success in his shipping ventures, and the collector had provided it, ensuring favorable winds, safe passages, and profitable cargo manifests for nearly 2 decades. In return, Josiah had offered something he considered expendable, the occasional servant who became inconvenient, the rare business rival who proved too troublesome to eliminate through conventional means. These individuals simply disappeared from normal existence while continuing to inhabit the house in a different capacity, their life force slowly consumed, while their consciousness remained trapped within the mansion's walls. The arrangement had worked magnificently for the first generation. Josiah's fortune grew exponentially. His reputation for reliability and success attracted the most lucrative contracts, and the few disappearances connected to his household were easily explained as departures for other employment or unfortunate accidents. When he died peacefully in his bed at the age of 73, he passed both his wealth and his obligations to his son, Bartholomew's father, with detailed instructions for maintaining the profitable relationship. But each generation had grown more squeamish, more reluctant to pay the prices that sustained their supernatural benefactor. Bartholomew's father had limited his offerings to genuinely undesirable individuals, criminals who threatened the family's reputation, servants who had discovered inconvenient secrets, competitors who engaged in practices that bordered on the illegal. The collector had accepted these offerings with patient tolerance, understanding that human sensibilities sometimes required accommodation, but the reduced feeding schedule had begun to affect the quality of services provided. By the time Bartholomew inherited both the business and the burden, the supernatural partnership had deteriorated significantly. His moral objections to what he saw as murder, combined with his impractical belief that he could maintain the arrangement, through negotiation rather than payment, had led to the steady decline of the family's fortunes. The collector was hungry, had been growing hungrier with each passing year, and had finally reached the limits of its patience with half measures and broken promises. Seraphina understood all of this with the crystalline clarity that sometimes comes to children who find themselves balanced on the edge of extraordinary circumstances. She had learned the house's history not through family stories or discovered documents, but through direct communication with its permanent residents, who had been eager to share their experiences with someone who could see and hear them clearly. Mrs. Ashford had been the first to explain the true nature of their situation during one of their afternoon conversations in the conservatory. The elderly woman retained all of her memories from life, including her initial confusion and terror, when she had realized that death had not brought the expected release, but rather a different kind of existence entirely. Over the 12 years of her residency, however, she had developed what could only be described as a perverse affection for her circumstances. "You must understand, dear child," she had explained in her cultured Boston accent, her translucent form flickering like candlelight as she spoke, "that what we experience here is not the crude horror that living minds imagine death to be. We are preserved, maintained in a state of perfect awareness without the inconveniences and deterioration of physical existence. I no longer require food or sleep, feel no pain or discomfort, and have been granted unlimited time to pursue contemplation and conversation with the most fascinating collection of individuals." Timothy Marsh, despite his youth, had offered a more practical perspective on their shared condition. "It's rather like being in school forever," he had said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized his personality both in life and afterwards. "There are rules to follow and lessons to learn, but once you understand how everything works, it's actually quite interesting. And we're never lonely. There's always someone new joining us eventually." Mr. Dalton had been the most recent addition to their community, having arrived less than a year ago when his business dealings with Bartholomew had reached an impasse over a substantial debt. His adjustment period had been more difficult, marked by attempts to leave the house and desperate efforts to contact the outside world, but he had eventually settled into the routine of their eternal society with the same resignation that characterized all the residents eventually. "The key," he had confided to Seraphina during one of their evening conversations, "is accepting that this existence, while different from what we expected, offers compensations that living never could. We have been granted a kind of immortality, freed from the physical limitations and temporal constraints that bind ordinary humans. In time, you learn to appreciate the advantages." But Seraphina had always known that her role in the household's supernatural ecosystem was different from that of the others. Where they had been collected to sustain the entity's feeding requirements, she was being prepared for something far more significant. The collector had been patient with her family for 3 generations, had tolerated reduced offerings, and delayed payments, but that patience had been an investment rather than mere tolerance. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right individual to serve as its permanent anchor in the physical world. The house needed a living occupant who could serve as both guardian and interface, someone who could manage the practical aspects of maintaining the collection while also facilitating the acquisition of new residents. Seraphina, with her natural ability to perceive and communicate with the supernatural residents, her inherited connection to the family's obligations, and her youth-enabled adaptability, represented the perfect candidate for this crucial position. If you're enjoying this chilling tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. She had been aware of her destiny for several months, had felt the house's influence growing stronger as her 8th birthday approached and passed. The supernatural residents had begun treating her differently, with the deference due to someone who would soon possess authority over their eternal community. Even her father had begun to sense the change, though his desperate self-deception prevented him from acknowledging what his subconscious mind had already accepted. Now, as she sat perfectly still for Mr. Vex's camera, feeling the weight of the empty birdcage in her lap and the attention of dozens of invisible observers focused upon her, Seraphina understood that the photograph was more than simple documentation. It was a ritual, a formal record of the moment when the final payment came due, and the Whitmore family's obligations transformed into something far more permanent. The brass cage that had once held Lucinda served as both symbol and instrument in this ceremony. Like the house itself, it had become a container for something that existed between life and death, a beautiful prison that preserved its occupant in a state of eternal suspension. Lucinda still lived within its confines, still sang her morning songs and preened her ethereal feathers, but she did so now as a citizen of the collector's domain, rather than as a creature of the natural world. Soon, very soon, Seraphina would join her beloved pet in that liminal existence, would take her place as the living heart of the house's supernatural community, while simultaneously becoming its most precious prisoner. She would retain her consciousness, her memories, her essential self, but she would never again walk in sunlight or feel rain on her skin, or experience the simple pleasure of growing older. The trade, she had decided, was acceptable. The world beyond their mansion had offered her nothing but the prospect of ordinary existence, childhood followed by adolescence, marriage, motherhood, aging, and eventual death. The house offered immortality, purpose, and the companionship of the most interesting collection of individuals she could imagine. More importantly, it offered her power, the ability to shape and guide the supernatural community that would continue to grow under her stewardship. As Mr. Vex made his final adjustments to the camera's settings, checking the focus and calculating the optimal exposure time, the parlor began to fill with the assembled residents. They materialized gradually, their translucent forms becoming more solid as the moment of transformation approached, until the room contained a congregation that spanned decades of carefully curated collection. Mrs. Ashford positioned herself directly behind Seraphina's chair, her elderly hands hovering just above the child's shoulders in a gesture of blessing and welcome. Timothy took his assigned place in the chair that appeared empty to adult eyes, while Mr. Dalton stationed himself near the window where he could serve as witness to the ceremony. Other residents, accumulated over the long years of the house's supernatural existence, filled the remaining spaces until the parlor resembled a formal gathering of the most exclusive and permanent social club imaginable. Bartholomew Whitmore stood to one side, his face pale and drawn as he watched his daughter prepare for what he believed was simply a portrait session. His desperate denial of the true circumstances had reached such intensity that he could no longer perceive the supernatural residents gathering around them, could not see the way the light in the room had taken on the quality of twilight despite the brightness of the October morning outside. The photographer himself remained blissfully unaware of anything beyond the technical challenges of capturing the perfect image. His camera, however, seemed to possess a sensitivity to the supernatural that its operator lacked, the lens and silver-coated plates responding to energies and presences that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. "Hold perfectly. Still, my dear," Mr. Vex instructed, his hand poised over the camera's shutter mechanism. "This exposure will require several minutes to complete, so it's essential that you maintain your position exactly as it is now." Seraphina nodded once, her dark eyes fixed on the camera lens with the same intense awareness that had characterized her expression throughout the morning. In her lap, the ornate birdcage seemed to pulse with its own internal light, the brass bars humming with harmonics that only she and the assembled residents could hear. Lucinda fluttered excitedly on her translucent perch, sensing the significance of the moment that would formalize her mistress's entry into their eternal society. The transformation had already begun, had been progressing slowly for months as Seraphina grew more connected to the house and its supernatural inhabitants. Soon the process would be complete, and the collector would finally possess the living anchor it had been cultivating so patiently. The Whitmore family's debt would be paid in full, but the payments would continue indefinitely, administered by their most precious offering. As Mr. Vex triggered the shutter and began the long exposure that would create one of the most haunting photographs ever captured, Seraphina felt the last threads connecting her to ordinary childhood dissolving like morning mist. The girl who would emerge from this parlor would still bear her name and appearance, but she would belong to a different world entirely, one where the boundaries between life and death were merely suggestions rather than absolute laws. The camera captured it all, the visible and invisible participants, the moment of transition, the birth of something that was neither entirely human nor wholly supernatural, but something new and unprecedented. And in the ornate birdcage that rested so carefully in her lap, Lucinda sang a welcoming song that only the dead and the dying could truly understand. The grandfather clock in the front hall had ceased its rhythmic chiming an hour ago, its bronze voice falling silent as if even time itself had paused to witness what was transpiring in the Whitmore parlor. The October morning light streaming through the tall windows had taken on an otherworldly quality, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and creating patterns of illumination that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. Cornelius Vex continued his methodical preparations, adjusting his camera's focus and calculating exposure times, blissfully unaware that he was documenting far more than a simple family portrait. Seraphina remained perfectly still in her assigned position, the ornate birdcage balanced in her lap like a crown awaiting coronation. She had been motionless for nearly 20 minutes now, her small frame displaying the supernatural discipline that marked her transition from ordinary child to something far more significant. The brass bars of the cage caught and reflected the strange light, creating geometric patterns that shifted and writhed when observed directly, while Lucinda fluttered with increasing excitement on her translucent perch, sensing the approaching culmination of months of careful preparation. The parlor itself had begun to transform, its familiar dimensions subtly altering as the boundary between the physical world and the collector's domain grew thinner with each passing moment. The wallpaper patterns seemed to move of their own accord, creating new designs that spoke to observers in languages that predated human speech. The heavy furniture appeared to shift position when viewed peripherally, rearranging itself to better accommodate the growing congregation of supernatural residents who filled every available space. Mrs. Ashford stood directly behind Seraphina's chair, her elderly form now solid enough to cast actual shadows despite her translucent nature. Her aristocratic features displayed an expression of maternal pride mixed with hungry anticipation, as if she were witnessing the debut of a particularly promising protégé. The other residents had positioned themselves throughout the room with the precision of a well-rehearsed theatrical performance, each occupying a specific location that contributed to the overall geometry of the ritual taking place. Bartholomew Whitmore watched from his position near the mantelpiece, his face pale with an exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. Over the past few months he had felt his strength steadily diminishing, though he attributed the decline to the stress of his financial difficulties rather than recognizing it as the price of his family's supernatural bargain. The collector had been patient with partial payments for years, accepting the occasional offering while allowing the Whitmore patriarch to maintain his illusions of moral superiority. But that patience had been an investment in this final moment when the debt would be settled in full. "Nearly ready now," Mr. Vex announced, his voice carrying clearly in the unnaturally still air of the parlor. He checked his pocket watch, a beautiful piece of Swiss craftsmanship that had belonged to his father, and noted the time with the professional precision that characterized all his photographic work. "The light is absolutely perfect, and the composition could not be more striking. This will certainly be among my finest portraits." What he could not see, what his adult perceptions refused to acknowledge, was that the perfect light was no longer natural sunlight but something else entirely, a luminescence that emanated from the assembled supernatural residents and created an atmosphere that existed somewhere between the world of the living and whatever realm lay beyond death. The composition that struck him as so aesthetically pleasing was actually the careful arrangement of a community welcoming its newest and most important member. As he prepared to trigger the camera's shutter, the temperature in the parlor began to drop with startling rapidity. Frost formed on the inside surfaces of the windows despite the October warmth outside, creating intricate crystalline patterns that resembled the brass scrollwork of Seraphina's cage. The photographer noticed the sudden chill and attributed it to the old house's poor insulation, pulling his coat more tightly around his shoulders while continuing his technical preparations. Seraphina felt the cold differently than the adults in the room, experiencing it not as discomfort but as a welcoming embrace from the entity that had been cultivating her for this moment throughout her young life. The collector's presence grew stronger with each degree of temperature drop, its ancient consciousness pressing closer to the physical world. As the carefully constructed ritual reached its climax, she could feel its attention focused upon her like a physical weight, could sense its satisfaction with the offering that represented the culmination of 3 generations of patient investment. The assembled residents began to manifest more solidly as the boundary between dimensions grew thinner, their translucent forms gaining substance and definition until they appeared almost as solid as the living occupants of the room. Timothy Marsh, seated in his designated chair, clasped his small hands together with childlike excitement, while Mr. Dalton straightened his top hat and adjusted his waistcoat with the dignity befitting a witness to history in the making. But it was Mrs. Ashford who served as the primary facilitator of the transformation, her elderly hands now resting with actual physical weight upon Seraphina's shoulders, as she had done with dozens of previous offerings over her 12 years of residence. Her cultured voice, when she spoke, carried clearly to everyone present, living and dead alike. "Welcome, dear child, to our eternal family," she murmured, her words creating visible puffs of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. "You have been chosen, for a great honor, to serve as guardian and guide to our community for as long as the stars continue to shine. Your sacrifice ensures our continued existence, and our presence ensures your immortality." The ritual had its own momentum now, proceeding according to patterns that had been established long before any of the current participants had been born. The collector's influence spread throughout the house, transforming the familiar mansion into something that existed partially outside normal reality, a place where the laws governing life and death became merely suggestions rather than absolute restrictions. Cornelius Vex, focused intently on his photographic equipment, remained unaware of the supernatural drama unfolding mere feet from his camera. His technical training had taught him to notice details of lighting and composition, but nothing in his experience had prepared him to recognize the signs of a reality-altering ritual taking place before his lens. The dropping temperature, the strange behavior of light and shadow, the way his breath now formed visible clouds despite the morning's warmth, all of these anomalies registered in his peripheral awareness, but were dismissed as environmental curiosities rather than supernatural phenomena. "Hold steady now," he instructed, his hand positioned over the shutter release mechanism. "This exposure will require several minutes to achieve the proper depth and clarity, so absolute stillness is essential." As he spoke, something began to go wrong with the carefully orchestrated ceremony. The transformation that was intended to claim Seraphina and bind her permanently to the house encountered an unexpected resistance, a quality within the child herself that proved more resilient than the collector had anticipated. Perhaps it was the purity of her heart, untainted by the desperate greed that had motivated previous generations of Whitmores. Or perhaps it was the presence of the camera itself, creating a technological anchor to the ordinary world that interfered with supernatural processes. If you're enjoying this chilling tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. The resistance manifested first as a subtle change in the quality of light filling the parlor, the otherworldly luminescence, flickering as if struggling to maintain its hold on reality. The assembled residents, who had grown increasingly solid as the ritual progressed, began to waver between states of existence, their carefully maintained forms becoming unstable as the supernatural energies that sustained them encountered opposition from an unexpected source. Seraphina felt the change as a sudden lightness, as if invisible chains that had been gradually tightening around her soul had suddenly loosened their grip. The sensation was both liberating and terrifying, offering her a glimpse of freedom that she had not realized was possible, even as it threatened to disrupt the only future she had been prepared to accept. The birdcage in her lap grew warm, then hot, the brass bars conducting energies that made her hands tingle with unfamiliar sensations. Within the cage, Lucinda began to sing with renewed vigor, her ethereal voice carrying notes that seemed to pierce the supernatural atmosphere like arrows of pure sound. The canary's song, which had grown progressively fainter as her connection to the physical world diminished, suddenly blazed with the intensity of her original living voice, as if the disruption of the ritual was allowing her to reclaim aspects of her stolen existence. The collector's response to this unexpected resistance was swift and terrible, its ancient rage filling the parlor like a physical presence that pressed against the walls and ceiling with crushing force. The entity had invested too much time and energy in cultivating Seraphina to accept failure at the crucial moment, had sacrificed too many opportunities, and delayed too many other plans to allow its carefully orchestrated design to be undone by childish innocence or technological interference. The supernatural residents felt their master's fury as a searing pain that cut through their preserved consciousness like molten metal, reminding them of the price of their continued existence and their obligations to ensure the ceremony's success. Mrs. Ashford's grip on Seraphina's shoulders tightened until her translucent fingers left visible marks on the child's white dress, while Timothy and Mr. Dalton moved closer to their assigned positions, their forms solidifying with desperate intensity. "Complete the binding," Mrs. Ashford hissed, her cultured accent now carrying undertones that spoke of influences far older and more terrible than mere human consciousness. "The child belongs to us now, has always belonged to us. She cannot be permitted to resist at the final moment." But Seraphina had discovered something unexpected within herself during those crucial seconds when the ritual faltered, a reservoir of strength that had nothing to do with supernatural preparation or mystical training, but rather stemmed from the simple human capacity for hope. She had accepted her destiny because she believed it was inevitable, had convinced herself that transformation into the collector's guardian offered advantages over ordinary existence, but the momentary glimpse of freedom had revealed the lie. Underlying that rationalization, she wanted to live, truly live, to experience childhood and adolescence and all the messy complications of human existence that she had been taught to despise. The house had offered her immortality, but at the cost of everything that made existence meaningful, preserving her consciousness while draining away her humanity until she would become nothing more than an ornate prison for her own soul. As Cornelius, Vex finally triggered the camera's shutter, beginning the long exposure that would document this moment of supernatural crisis, Seraphina made her choice. Instead of accepting the binding that would transform her into the collector's permanent anchor, she pushed back against the forces attempting to claim her, drawing upon reserves of will that surprised even her supernatural adversaries. The result was catastrophic for the carefully constructed ritual, creating a feedback effect that sent waves of disruption throughout the house's supernatural ecosystem. The assembled residents flickered between states of existence, their preserved forms becoming unstable as the energies that sustained them were redirected to combat Seraphina's unexpected resistance. The parlor itself began to shift between dimensions, sometimes appearing as the familiar Victorian sitting room and sometimes revealing itself as something far more alien and threatening. Bartholomew Whitmore, finally forced to acknowledge the supernatural forces that had shaped his family's destiny, watched in horror as his daughter became the focal point of a battle between dimensions. The financial ruin he had feared seemed trivial compared to the possibility of losing Seraphina to forces he had never fully understood, obligations he had inherited without comprehending their true cost. The camera, however, continued its mechanical function regardless of the chaos surrounding it, the silver-coated plates capturing every moment of the supernatural conflict with the impartial precision of scientific documentation. The long exposure, intended to create a simple family portrait, instead recorded the precise instant when the boundary between life and death became completely unstable, preserving a moment of transition that would haunt viewers for generations to come. But even as she fought against the forces attempting to claim her, Seraphina realized that her resistance came with its own terrible price. The disruption of the ritual had created a state of suspension rather than freedom, trapping her between the world of the living and the realm of the collected dead without offering true escape to either. She had avoided immediate transformation into the collector's guardian, but at the cost of being frozen in the liminal moment between human childhood and supernatural servitude. The photograph captured it all, the visible and invisible participants, the moment of crisis when ancient plans went awry, the birth of something unprecedented that was neither victory nor defeat, but something far more complex and disturbing, and in the ornate birdcage that had been intended to serve as both symbol and instrument of transformation, Lucinda sang her defiant song into a world that could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead. The computer screen in Harvard's basement archives began to flicker at exactly 3:33 a.m., the digital enhancement of Seraphina's photograph wavering between the static image Cordelia had been studying and something that defied every law of photographic science. What had been a frozen moment captured in silver and time suddenly showed signs of movement, subtle at first. A tremor in the child's dark eyes, a slight shift in the positioning of the spectral figures surrounding her, but gradually becoming more pronounced until both researchers found themselves staring at what could only be described as a window into the past. "This is impossible," Ezekiel whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming of the computer. "Equipment." He reached toward the keyboard, intending to check the software settings, but his hand stopped mid-motion as Seraphina's eyes on the screen shifted to look directly at him, not at the camera that had captured her image 112 years ago, but at him, personally, in the present moment, as if she could see through the digital interface into the basement archives where he sat, transfixed by her gaze. Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat as the impossible became undeniable. The photograph was no longer simply displaying the enhanced details they had uncovered through digital manipulation. It was actively changing, evolving, showing them scenes that had never been captured by Cornelius Vex's camera, but which seemed to be unfolding in real time across the centuries. The parlor background shifted and wavered, sometimes showing the Victorian sitting room they had studied for hours, sometimes revealing glimpses of the same space as it existed in different time periods, including what appeared to be its current state of decay. The Whitmore house on Chestnut Street had been abandoned for decades, according to the historical records Cordelia had researched, its windows boarded and its elegant facade surrendering to the inevitable entropy that claimed all human constructions. Yet through the impossible window of the enhanced photograph, they could see the parlor as it existed now. Wallpaper peeling in long strips, furniture covered with dust sheets like shrouds, floorboards warped and stained with moisture that had seeped through the damaged roof over many winters. But the house was not empty. The supernatural residents that had been revealed through digital enhancement were still there, still maintaining their eternal vigil in rooms that no living person had entered for years. Mrs. Ashford continued her aristocratic posturing near the mantelpiece, her translucent form unchanged by the passage of time, while Timothy Marsh played his endless games in corners where shadows gathered like living things. Mr. Dalton maintained his post by the windows, watching a street that had forgotten the house existed while the house remembered every soul that had ever walked its sidewalks. And at the center of it all, Seraphina remained in her chair, the ornate birdcage still balanced in her lap. Frozen, in the moment of interrupted transformation that had suspended her between life and death for over a century. She had aged not a single day since the camera's shutter had captured her defiance, but the accumulated weight of decades spent in liminal suspension had given her eyes a depth of knowledge that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. "She's trying to communicate," Cordelia realized, watching as Seraphina's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that carried no voice across the digital interface. Something about the ritual. It didn't complete properly. She's been trapped in that moment, conscious and aware, for 112 years. As if responding to Cordelia's recognition, the image on the screen began to change more dramatically. The perspective shifted, pulling back to reveal more of the parlor, and both researchers gasped as they realized they were no longer simply viewing the photograph but somehow experiencing the space itself. The basement archives around them seemed to fade, becoming translucent like the supernatural residents, while the Victorian parlor grew more solid and immediate until they found themselves standing in a room that existed simultaneously in 1899 and 2011. The sensation was profoundly disorienting, like experiencing two realities overlaid upon each other with imperfect alignment. They could see the parlor as it had been during the photography session, elegantly furnished, filled with morning light, occupied by the living and the dead, while also perceiving it as it existed in the present day, decayed, abandoned, haunted, by the same supernatural residents who had grown more solid with each passing decade of isolation. Seraphina turned in her chair to face them directly, her movement creating ripples in the overlapping realities that made the air itself seem to shimmer with possibility. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite the century that separated their respective timelines, the words emerging from the photograph's speakers with crystalline clarity that suggested the digital enhancement had somehow become a conduit for direct communication. "You have seen the truth," she said, her child's voice carrying undertones of experience that belonged to someone far older. "You understand what was done here, what was attempted, and what failed. The ritual was never completed, leaving me suspended between states of existence, conscious but unable to live or die properly." Ezekiel stepped closer to the computer screen, his scientific training warring with the evidence of his senses. "How is this possible? You're speaking to us across 112 years. Digital images don't have consciousness, don't have the ability to interact with viewers." Seraphina's smile held both sadness and a kind of terrible wisdom. "Time is not as linear as your modern minds believe. The house exists partially outside normal temporal flow, a repository for moments and memories that refuse to surrender to the natural progression of cause and effect. Your digital enhancement work has strengthened the connection between past and present, allowing communication across the barriers that usually separate different periods of existence." The parlor around them continued to shift between its historical and contemporary states, creating a visual representation of the temporal instability that had resulted from the failed ritual. Furniture appeared and disappeared, wallpaper changed patterns like living skin, and the very architecture of the room seemed to breathe with its own organic rhythm. Mrs. Ashford materialized beside Seraphina's chair, her aristocratic bearing unchanged despite the decades of supernatural residence. "The child speaks truly," she announced in her cultured accent. "We have been waiting for someone with the proper knowledge and tools to establish communication with the outside world. Your research has opened a bridge that we have been unable to create through our own efforts." "What do you want?" Cordelia asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. It was Timothy Marsh who responded, his youthful features animated with the excitement of a child discussing a favored game. "We want to expand our collection naturally. The house has been isolated for too long, cut off from the opportunities for growth that sustained us in earlier periods. But we also want to complete the ritual that was interrupted so many years ago, to finally resolve Seraphina's suspended state." The implications of his words sent a chill through both researchers that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold emanating from the computer screen. They had not simply discovered a historical mystery or documented an unusual photographic phenomenon. They had established contact with entities that possessed both the desire and, apparently, the ability to extend their influence into the modern world. Mr. Dalton stepped forward from his position near the windows, adjusting his top hat with the dignity that characterized all his movements. "The enhancement process you have employed has created a technological bridge between our realm and yours," he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. "Each adjustment to the image parameters has strengthened the connection, allowing us to manifest more fully in your reality." As he spoke, both Cordelia and Ezekiel became aware that the basement archives around them had grown noticeably colder, frost beginning to form on the computer equipment and their breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. The same environmental changes that had marked the original ritual in 1899 were beginning to manifest in 2011, suggesting that the supernatural residents were somehow extending their influence through the digital interface. "We need to disconnect," Ezekiel said urgently, reaching for the computer's power button, but his hand passed through the equipment as if it were made of mist. the solid reality of the modern world becoming as insubstantial as the ghostly figures they had been studying. Seraphina rose from her chair, the birdcage still cradled in her arms, and approached the boundary between the overlapping realities, with the serene confidence of someone who had spent more than a century preparing for this moment. "You cannot simply disconnect," she said gently. "The bridge has been established, the connection made permanent. You have been researching us, studying our existence, learning our names and our histories. In doing so, you have created the same kind of relationship that brought all of our residents into the house's collection." The truth of their situation settled over both researchers like a shroud. Their academic interest in the photograph had been more than simple scholarly curiosity. It had been the beginning of the same process that had claimed Mrs. Ashford, Timothy, Mr. Dalton, and countless others over the decades. By studying the supernatural residents, by learning their identities and understanding their circumstances, Cordelia and Ezekiel had unknowingly initiated their own recruitment into the house's eternal community. "The collection requires knowledgeable caretakers," Mrs. Ashford explained, her tone suggesting she was discussing a prestigious appointment rather than supernatural entrapment. "Individuals with the proper education and analytical skills to assist in managing our community's growth and development. Your academic backgrounds make you ideal candidates for such positions." The basement archives continued to fade around them while the Victorian parlor grew more solid and present, the transition occurring so gradually that resistance seemed impossible. They were being drawn into the photograph, pulled across time and space to join the residents they had spent the night studying with such fascination. But even as the reality of their situation became undeniable, Cordelia found herself thinking about Seraphina's earlier words regarding the incomplete ritual. The child had been suspended between states for 112 years, conscious but unable to fully exist in either the world of the living or the realm of the collected dead. Perhaps their arrival represented not just an opportunity for the house to acquire new residents, but a chance to finally resolve the supernatural crisis that had been festering since 1899. If you're enjoying this chilling tale, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. "What would happen," she asked, addressing Seraphina directly, "if the original ritual were finally completed? If the suspension that has trapped you for so long were resolved?" The child's expression grew thoughtful, as if the question had opened possibilities she had not previously considered. "I am not certain," she admitted. "The failed ritual created an unprecedented situation that exists outside the normal patterns of the house's collection process. Completing it might allow me to assume my intended role as guardian, or it might release all of us from the supernatural bonds that maintain our existence here. Or," Timothy added with the brutal honesty characteristic of children, "it might destroy everyone and everything connected to the house, living and dead alike. Unfinished magical workings can be quite unstable when finally resolved." The gathered residents fell silent, contemplating the implications of Timothy's words. For over a century, they had existed in a state of preserved immortality that offered consciousness without the inconveniences of physical existence. But they had also been trapped by the same supernatural forces that sustained them. The possibility of resolution, whether it brought freedom or destruction, represented the first real change in their circumstances since their individual arrivals. Ezekiel, still struggling to accept the reality of their situation, made one final attempt to understand their circumstances through rational analysis, assuming this is actually happening and not some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. What exactly are our options? Can we simply refuse to participate in whatever resolution you're proposing, Mr. Dalton's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. "You established the connection through your research, young man. You learned our names, studied our histories, invested emotional energy in understanding our circumstances. The house responds to that kind of attention, draws strength from it, uses it to bridge the gap between our reality and yours. You cannot simply withdraw your interest now that the process has begun." The transformation accelerated as he spoke, the modern world around them becoming increasingly translucent, while the Victorian parlor achieved full solidity. Soon they would complete their journey across time and space, joining the permanent collection of residents who had been gathered over generations of careful cultivation. But the question of Seraphina's interrupted ritual remained, offering possibilities that none of them fully understood. As the convergence reached its final stage, both timelines merged completely, creating a single moment that existed simultaneously. In 1899 and 2011, Cornelius Vex continued his photography session, unaware that his carefully composed portrait now included two additional figures in modern clothing, while Cordelia and Ezekiel found themselves standing in a parlor that belonged to both centuries and neither. The enhanced photograph had become a gateway, the digital technology serving as a bridge between past and present that allowed the supernatural residents to finally expand their influence beyond the confines of the abandoned house. But it had also created an opportunity for resolution that had been impossible for over a century, a chance to complete the interrupted ritual and discover what lay beyond the suspended moment that had defined Seraphina's existence. The cameras, shutter closed with mechanical precision, capturing an image that would perplex viewers for generations to come. A daguerreotype that showed not just the original residents of 1899, but their modern counterparts as well, all gathered around a child who held the key to mysteries that transcended the boundaries between life and death. In her lap, the ornate birdcage pulsed with supernatural energy, its brass bars humming with harmonics that spoke of transformation and possibility. Within its confines, Lucinda sang her eternal song to an audience that now included representatives from 2 centuries, while outside the windows of a house that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, the world continued its normal progression, unaware that the very nature of reality had just been fundamentally altered by the convergence of digital technology and supernatural forces that had been waiting over a century for their moment of reunion. The photograph was complete, but the story it told would continue to unfold across the boundaries of time itself, drawing new participants into its web of mystery and transformation with each viewing, each enhancement, each attempt to understand the truth hidden in the shadows of a Victorian parlor where the living and the dead had gathered to witness something that had never been attempted before and might never be attempted again.